So just to orient ourselves, on the left here we have test.php, on the right we have functions.inc. So this is our old file, this is our new one. The blue indicates code that exists on one side but not on the other. The gray indicates where there are some differences between one line and another. And then anything that's white is the same on both sides. So you can see in the original we had all this code above where the functions began. In this side it just starts with the functions. The function start adventure session is identical on both sides, and then the changes begin here at the run command function. You see in our original we globalized 3 different variables: data, log array, and standard text. But on this side they've been removed. Now the reason we can do that now is because we've added some additional functions that will handle storing and retrieving these various pieces of data instead of globalizing them. And that will allow our code to be more stable as we make changes to it, because we won't have to worry about overriding any of these variables inside of functions where we wouldn't expect to be able to use a global variable. Now we can begin to see the differences as we move down here. Again, this is all white, so this is the same. When we add an item to the log array in our original. Now what we used to do was add an item to the end of this log array, and then at the end of the file we'd use an implode function in order to take this array and convert it into an HTML list. Let's go ahead and scroll down to make sure that we're lining things up here. On this side, we use a function called journal. Now this is a function that we define a little bit later on in the file, and so we'll get to that in a moment. But we pass it the same text that's used to add to the log array here. And you see that here's another place where we're using journal instead of adding to the log array. Now let's take note of where we are in the file comparison. We're at the 4th difference here, and let's scroll down to see what the journal function does. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down on this side, and you see here's our function. You see this is blue because it's entirely new code. So the description says a multi-use function to either add an entry to the log or render the log. And here's our function journal, and it takes potentially 2 parameters, text and action. But you see we have defaults for each, so we can just run journal without passing anything to it. Now our first line here says static log array. Now static is a really interesting and valuable keyword to know. What it does is it says that this variable will persist inside of this function. So the next time that we run this function, the value of log array will be stored and can be used the next time the function is run. So this can be useful for creating a counter, for example, inside of a function that will add a new item to the counter every time the function is called, regardless of where it's called from. And so what we're doing here is creating a variable called log array, making it static, and then adding to it every time this function is called. And then at the end of the script, we're going to use this function again in order to return that variable after it's been imploded into an HTML list. So this next part handles whether we're passing the action add or if we're passing the action get. If we're going to add the item, all we're going to do is add an element to the end of the log array. Now before we were using the log array directly in our code, which we could do because it was globalized. But now this log array is specific to our function, so we can't use it outside of our function. But because we're using static, we can continue to add to it, even though we're using the function later on in our code. Now we're also using this function to be able to retrieve code as well. So we can pass a different action to it called get, which will render the log array as a list and return that. So you might recognize this code here. If the count of our log array equals 0, which means that we haven't added any items to the log array yet, what we're going to do is add an item using the journal function. So you see we're using the journal function from within the journal function, which is completely valid. And what we're doing is adding the description of the current location using a new function called current location data. Now we're going to look at this function in just a moment, but finally what we do is convert this log array into an HTML list and then return that. Now we could have also printed this, but by returning it, we allow the user who's calling this function to determine where exactly they want to print it and organize their code however they'd like. So they don't necessarily have to have a function call in the place where they're going to be printing the content. Now while we're here, let's go ahead and look at this other function that we've added called getJournal. The comment here says a shortcut function, and what this does is simply call journal, but it passes get as the action parameter. So whenever we have one function that has several different actions that can occur within it, Sometimes it's good to have shortcut functions so that all of the functionality of that function is exposed. It can be a little hard to track down what a multi-use function can do without those shortcut functions. Plus, if you're using an IDE, most of them will compile a list of the functions available on the page, and so you can easily scan the functionality simply by looking at the function names. Okay, so the other new function that we ran into was current location data. In our previous code, what we did was access the data variable directly, and then we grabbed the place from the session variable, which saves where the user currently is on the map, and then grabs the description element from that data variable. Now, if you're just looking at this code and trying to figure out what's going on, it can be a bit of a challenge. You have to figure out what data means and where place comes from and what it means in this context. The function that we're using now, called current location data, is much more descriptive, so it's easier to tell what it does exactly. Also, using data directly means that we have to globalize the data variable, whereas with this current location data function, we don't need to do that because we're grabbing that data from another source.